Welcome to Staying in My Lane podcast. Today I want to talk about Mean Girls. Unfortunately, I think it's something that far too often many women can relate to. Even as adults, we assume that once we leave middle school or high school, we'll leave that behavior behind too. But sometimes the people change, the setting changes, and the age changes, while the behavior simply becomes more subtle. In a previous episode, I briefly spoke about reconnecting with some old friends after a misunderstanding, how taking space left me a little hesitant to rebuild that trust again. Rebuilding that foundation was not easy, and it required a lot of thinking, reflection, and honestly, sitting with some really uncomfortable emotions. However, taking the time and creating that distance also gave me something I didn't realize I had lost: a sense of security. It allowed me to slow down, process what happened, and ultimately reconnect with myself instead of trying to constantly make sense of everyone else. As I sat down to write this week's episode, I found myself rewriting it over and over again. At first, I wasn't sure I even wanted to talk about any of this. Part of me wanted to leave it alone because I realized that reconnecting was probably not the best idea. That's one of the reasons why I hesitated making this episode. Not because I was afraid to speak, but because I knew this conversation could easily be misunderstood or twisted, especially by mean girls. I never want my words to add more noise to a world that already has enough of it. I reminded myself why I started this podcast in the first place. I have thought about the numerous messages I've received from people who have said that they finally feel understood. I've thought about the countless women who have messaged, texted, emailed, and even called me, telling me they feel less alone after hearing someone put words to experiences that they've had. That's when I realized this conversation isn't just about my experience, it's about something much bigger. Patterns that we see in friendships, groups, and even sometimes within ourselves. It's about understanding the psychology behind conflict instead of simply reacting to it. Because if I'm walking through something, there's a good chance someone else is too. If sharing my experience helps even one person feel less alone, question a harmful pattern, or see a difficult situation from a different perspective, then I believe that this conversation is worth having. The numbers speak for themselves, but more importantly, so do your stories. Every message reminds me that so many of us are carrying experiences that we have never quite known how to explain. My hope is that this episode puts words to another one of those experiences. Not to create division, not to encourage drama or involve in gossip, not to attack anyone, but to better understand why these patterns continue to exist and how we can choose something healthier. Before we start the conversation, I want to set the intention. I want to make something very clear. Although I will be discussing a personal experience, I won't be naming names or sharing details. My intention is not to create drama, gossip, or encourage anyone to take sides. My goal, however, with my podcast and in this episode is to understand the difference between healthy behavior and unhealthy behavior, not attack people. And there's a big difference with that. I want to explore the psychology behind misunderstandings, assumptions, gossip, conflict, and why we sometimes treat one another the way that we do. I want to explore not only what happened, but why these patterns continue to repeat themselves in friendships, families, workplaces, and communities. Because I truly believe that when we understand the psychology behind our behavior, we become better equipped to change it. I want to break down patterns that keep repeating in our lives so that we can recognize them, learn from them, and hopefully become healthier versions of ourselves. That's what this whole podcast has always been about. Not perfection, not pretending that we have it all figured out. It's about slowing down long enough to ask better questions, challenging our own assumptions, looking at life through different lenses, and growing because we're willing to learn, not just about other people, but about ourselves as well. Let's start with the psychology of first impressions and assumptions. One thought that has stayed with me through this entire experience is that if people are allowed to publicly speak negatively about someone, then I also believe that we should be able to publicly process what happened and what those experiences taught us. The difference is we are not going to attack people. We are here to understand them, not to seek revenge, but to seek understanding. I know what it feels like to have your words twisted. I know what it feels like to have your intentions questioned before anyone has even asked you a single question. I know what it feels like to have your character judged by people who already have decided they know who you are before you've even met them, or they've given you a chance to have the opportunity to show them. And once someone thinks that they have you figured out, changing that belief can feel almost impossible. I think that's what makes this conversation so relatable. Every single one of us has experienced being misunderstood in one way or another. Every single one of us has probably made those assumptions about someone else at some point too, because that's what the human brain does. It searches for patterns, fills in blanks, and creates stories. The problem is that our brains don't always wait for the evidence before writing those stories. We hear a rumor, we see a social media post, we overhear part of a conversation. Someone shares their version of an event. And before we even realize what's happening, our minds begin connecting dots that were never ours to connect in the first place. Without meaning to, we begin confusing information with truth, assumptions and opinions with truth. We convince ourselves that we know someone's character based on fragments of information that we've collected instead of experiences that we actually have had with that person. We become so confident in our conclusions that we've never personally verified, which is a problem. What's even more fascinating is that we often adopt the opinions of other people closest to us without even realize that we're doing it. Sometimes we don't see people for who they really are. We are seeing them through someone else's perspective, through someone else's hurt, through someone else's assumption, someone else's story. And if we're never willing to question that story, borrowed opinions quietly become our own. Not because we are trying to purposefully or intentionally hurt somebody, but because our brains are wired to do that. Let me explain. Our brains are wired to seek belonging. As human beings, we have an incredible need to feel accepted, to feel safe, to feel like we're part of something. Because of that, we naturally look for people and we look to people around us for cues about how we're supposed to think, who we're supposed to trust, and sometimes who we're supposed to avoid. That's why, without even realizing it, we can inherit the assumptions, judgments, and beliefs of the people that we spend the most time with. We don't always stop and ask ourselves, do I actually believe this? Sometimes we simply absorb it because everyone else around us seems to believe it too. That's exactly where this conversation begins. Let's talk about how rumors become reality. Most of us like to believe that we judge people based on our own experiences. But if we are being honest, that's not always true. Sometimes we think we know someone because we've seen their social media, we've heard a rumor, or it's because someone we trust shared their version of an experience before we have even had a meaningful conversation with that person. Our brains have already started writing a story about who they are. The scary part is, once that story begins, our brains naturally start searching for evidence to support it. We convince ourselves that something must be true because we've heard it from more than one person. The thing that we have to remember is that repetition is not evidence. Familiarity is not proof. Hearing the same rumor over and over again, the same story from different people, doesn't automatically make it factual. It often just means that the same story has been repeated 4 different times. Psychology has a name for part of what's happening here: social conformity. As social creatures, we're constantly paying attention to people around us. When someone we trust shares an opinion about another person, we are much more likely to accept that opinion as fact. We're much more likely to believe them. Not necessarily because we've examined all the facts, but because our brains are trying to maintain that connection with the people around us. If we look back at history, belonging is what kept us alive. It increased our chances of survival. So our brains become incredibly good at aligning with the group. For example, our ancestors probably didn't pay that much attention to who picked the sweetest berries off the tree. They did, in fact, pay attention to who betrayed the group, because betraying the group put them in danger. Our brains are wired to look for threats, and sometimes that can be good. but sometimes it means that we're not seeing people for who they actually are. We end up looking through the lens of someone else's opinion, disappointment, assumptions, interpretation, and someone else's pain. It's kind of looking through rose-colored lenses. Unless we are willing to slow down, become curious, and ask ourselves, is this actually my experience with this person? Those borrowed opinions quietly become our own. The lenses that we're wearing may not belong to us. One of the most important questions that we can ask ourselves is, do I know this person, or do I know the story that I've been told about this person? Those are two very different definitions. Sometimes these experiences cause stories to be written about people that are simply not true. Recently, I experienced a situation that caught me completely off guard, which ultimately led me to here with you guys today. One of the things that I've thought about since this whole thing happened was that it's incredibly interesting to me how fast a story can take on a life of its own. A misunderstanding becomes a rumor becomes an assumption becomes someone else's version of the truth. Somehow, the person that the story is actually about is often the last person given the opportunity to speak, if they're even given an opportunity at all. Not about what was assumed, not about what was imagined, but about what actually happened. A little over a month ago, my husband and I went to a dinner with a group of people. Honestly, we don't go out very often anymore, so this felt different. I was excited because it was one of the first times in a long time that I'd finally started feeling comfortable around this particular group. So what did I do? I let my guard down. I relaxed. I genuinely thought I was having a great time. Looking back, I think that's exactly why this happened. So to explain, a month later, after that dinner, I learned that I had been accused of doing something that I know without question I did not do. To this day, I have never seen any evidence supporting the accusation. I've never been shown a screenshot. I've never been shown a message. I've never been shown anything that would explain why this accusation was made in the first place. Yet, despite that, conversations had been had behind my back, opinions had already been formed, and conclusions had already been reached without any explanation. What's ironic is that the person who accused me of this wasn't even in attendance at the dinner. People had been discussing this story about me before I knew that there was a story being told. It wasn't just being accused of something that wasn't true, it was realizing that people had been convinced of something without evidence, without asking me a single question, and without giving me an opportunity to explain what had actually happened. I cannot speak to anyone else's intentions, and I don't think it's appropriate to speculate. I can only speak from my own experiences. From where I was standing, it felt like a conclusion had already been reached, and that search for the truth was not even in the cards. It honestly felt like a plot against my character, because the accusation was so far-fetched that it's something I would never even think of doing. And again, the person that accused me of this isn't even someone I speak to, I socialize with, or I'm friends with. So for that to happen just didn't make any sense. From where I was standing, it felt like that narrative had already been created before anyone had spoken to me directly. Instead of someone coming to me with a simple question, it felt like I walked into a conversation where assumptions had already been made, conclusions had been reached behind my back. That's where the psychology gives us another lens to look through. Let's talk about gossip, validation, and emotional maturity. Researchers describe this as informational gossip. Most of us think that gossip is simply talking behind someone's back. Psychology tells us that it's much more complicated. Gossip serves a social function. It's used to exchange information, strengthen social bonds, and consciously or unconsciously decide who belongs within a group. The problem is that information rarely stays the same as it moves from one person to another. Every time a story is retold, it picks up a little bit more interpretation, a little bit more emotion, fewer assumptions, more assumptions, or a little more personal bias. By the time it reaches the next person, it's often not the same story anymore. This is one of the reasons why psychology compares gossip to the childhood game of telephone. The story changes with every person who repeats it. Looking back, what hurt me the most wasn't simply being accused of something I knew wasn't true. It was realizing that I had unknowingly become the topic of conversations that I was not a part of. Questions about me had been answered before I even had an opportunity to answer them myself. Conclusions had been reached and formed before I even knew there was something to explain. There was no opportunity to answer questions or defend myself. No opportunity to provide context or ask questions. No opportunity to protect my own character before opinions had already started taking shape. One of the hardest parts to that was I didn't even realize I was the person being discussed. I genuinely believed I was listening to someone share something that they were struggling with. I responded with empathy because that's what I believed the moment called for. I had no idea that somewhere along the way I had become part of the story. Looking back now, that's probably one of the most painful realizations. Sometimes you don't even know your name has entered a conversation until long after everyone else has formed an opinion. Here's what happened. In the group conversation that I was a part of, right in front of my face, and perhaps in conversations that had happened long before I even knew there was an issue, I had already become the topic. I had already become the target without even realizing there was a target. That's why it bothered me so much at the time. It wasn't simply because someone believed something about me that wasn't true. It's because by the time I became aware of the situation, it felt like the conversation had already happened without me. Questions had already been answered. Opinions had already started forming. The narrative had already begun. To me, that's one of the hardest parts of being misunderstood. Because when someone brings another person into a conversation, only after they've already spoken to everyone else first, it often stops feeling like they're seeking clarity and starts feeling like they're seeking reassurance with the version of events they've created to make sure that everyone else thinks it's correct. Psychology tells us there's a difference between seeking understanding and seeking validation. They're not the same thing. Eventually, I confronted the person who made the initial allegation. Her response was that she did not like confrontation. Let me explain why I have a big problem with that. If confrontation makes you uncomfortable, why do you feel the need to involve multiple other people before speaking to the one person who could actually answer your questions? Why allow conversations to grow around someone instead of having a conversation with them first? To me, emotional maturity is not avoiding uncomfortable conversations. It's choosing to have them respectfully. It's being willing to tolerate temporary discomfort in order to create long-term trust. Because the truth is, difficult conversations are uncomfortable for almost everyone, whether you like confrontation or not. Emotional maturity is not measured by whether conflict feels uncomfortable, it's measured by how we choose to handle that discomfort. The entire experience left me feeling exposed, embarrassed, and judged for something that I didn't even do. Even more painful was realizing that I didn't even know people believed I had done it. I wasn't just walking away hurt and confused. I was walking away realizing that somewhere along the line a story had been created about me that I didn't even know existed in the moment. The best way I can describe it is basically walking into a story that everyone else was reading, and I had just started the book. I had no idea what was going on. A story was built on assumptions, judgments, interpretations, and opinions. Unfortunately, that's how quickly narratives replace reality. So let's pause the story for a moment and turn to psychology. Looking back, I don't think that the situation was about me at all. I think that it reflects something much bigger, something that happens in families, friendships, communities, and workplaces every single day. Let's ask a bigger question. Why do people gossip in the first place? Why do rumors spread so quickly? Why are we as humans so fascinated by information about someone who isn't even in the room? Psychologists have studied gossip for decades. What they found genuinely surprises me. When most people hear the word gossip, we immediately think of something or somebody being malicious. Psychology suggests that gossip actually is much more complicated than that. We imagine someone intentionally trying to destroy another person's reputation. And sometimes that does happen. In fact, one of the reasons gossip can become so dangerous is because it often doesn't begin with malicious intent. It begins with uncertainty. Someone shares a concern, someone adds their interpretation or feelings, another person fills in a missing piece, someone repeats what they'd heard because it sounds believable. Before long, no one is discussing facts anymore. They're discussing a story that has slowly evolved with every conversation. That's one of the reasons why gossip can feel so convincing. It usually doesn't grow through evidence, it grows through repetition. Researchers estimate that a significant portion of our daily conversations involves talking about other people. Depending on the study, it can make up for well over half of the conversations that we have every single day. Most of it isn't even necessarily cruel, it's simply exchanging social information. For example, who is dating who got promoted, who got divorced, who moved away, who's struggling, who's succeeding. On the surface, that doesn't sound harmful. Sometimes it genuinely isn't. But here's where psychology becomes fascinating. Our brains evolved to pay attention to those conversations because, again, thousands of years ago, understanding social relationships helped us survive. Goes back to that whole thing where our ancestors paid attention to the ones who betrayed the group and not the ones that picked the sweetest berries. Humans didn't survive because we were the strongest species. We survived because we lived in those groups. Living in groups meant knowing who could be trusted, who shared resources, who was being cooperative, who protected the group, and who might put the group at risk. Psychologists sometimes describe gossip as an evolutionary shortcut. Instead of learning everything through trial and error, we learn through observation and through other people's stories. Thousands of years ago, that was incredibly useful. Today, it can also be incredibly dangerous. Our world has changed. Our brains have not changed nearly as much as we like to think they have. Stay with me. The same mental system that once protected our ancestors also convinced us to believe stories that we've never personally verified. Think about that for a second. How many opinions have you formed about someone who you've never actually sat down with and had a meaningful conversation with? We all should be saying that we have. That's what makes this conversation so uncomfortable. That's why rumors can feel so believable. Our brains constantly scan our environment, asking one question over and over again. Who is safe? So when our brains hear a story about a person, and the story is a rumor, a negative opinion, our brains don't often file it away as an interesting information flag. They file it away as a potential warning. Even if we've never witnessed the story or the person or the behavior ourselves. Even if we've never spoken to that person. Even if we've never verified whether a story is actually true. Psychology shows that negative information sticks in our brains much more strongly than positive information. This is called negativity bias. Our brains remember criticism, put downs, more easily than compliments. They remember betrayal more easily than kindness. One rumor can outweigh years of someone's good character in the mind of a person who barely knows them. That's how powerful negativity bias is. It's why one accusation can spread faster than 100 acts of integrity. It's why people remember the rumor long after they've forgotten about the correction. That's exactly why protecting someone else's reputation when they're not in the room matters so deeply. Once a negative story enters someone's mind, our brains don't just remember it. They start looking for all the evidence that it was true all along. Another psychological concept that plays a role is called confirmation bias. When someone begins believing a story about another person, their brains naturally start searching for evidence that confirms what they already believe. Every interaction becomes filtered through that expectation. Every neutral facial expression may look rude. A quiet personality suddenly becomes suspicious. Someone keeping to themselves suddenly becomes standoffish. The person necessarily hasn't changed. The lens through which they're being viewed has. Once that lens is in place, it becomes incredibly difficult to remove. Researchers also show us that rumors don't usually spread because people know that they are true. They spread because people think they might be true. Psychologists have studied rumor transmission for years and have found that uncertainty is one of the biggest drivers to gossip. When our brains don't have enough information, they dislike that uncertainty. So when people gossip, it fills in the blanks, creating expectations, connecting dots, making assumptions, and building stories that feel complete, even when important pieces are missing. So after hearing those assumptions, opinions, rumors repeated enough times, they begin to feel like facts. That's one of the reasons why rumors often spread more easily than corrections. A rumor creates curiosity, while a correction feels less emotionally interesting. Here's the part that really made me stop and think. Most people don't intentionally set out to believe something that isn't true. They're simply trying to make sense of incomplete information. The problem is, once our brains start believing we figured something out, they become surprisingly resistant to letting go of that conclusion that they had already made prior. That's why curiosity is so critical. Curiosity slows the brain down. It asks, "What don't I know yet?" Curiosity leaves room for another explanation. Certainty, on the other hand, often closes the door before the whole story has been told. I think that's one of the greatest lessons psychology can teach us. The healthiest minds aren't the ones that jump to conclusions the fastest. They're the ones willing to tolerate uncertainty long enough to ask another question. Maybe the most emotionally mature thing we can do is not to say, "I know what happened." Maybe it's, "I don't know the whole story yet." Because hearing something isn't the same as witnessing it yourself. Repeating something isn't the same as verifying it. Believing something isn't the same as it being true. Going back to the personal story that I shared, when I asked to see some evidence, whatever it was, I was told that nobody had it. No one could produce it. That was the moment that made me stop and think. Because if there's no evidence, what exactly are people believing? And then it hit me. They are believing a story that they heard, not because it was personally verified. In fact, it couldn't be personally verified by anybody because there was no evidence. Not because they witnessed it, but because somewhere along the line, the story itself became believable. Psychology tells us that our brains are incredibly uncomfortable with that uncertainty. We would often rather have an explanation, even if it's incomplete, instead of sitting with the discomfort of not knowing. Our brains are designed to fill in the blanks. Think about how fast we connect the dots that maybe don't even belong together, the puzzle pieces that don't fit. We assume motives, create explanations, and once those explanations begin circulating, they become surprisingly difficult to challenge. That's why I believe curiosity is one of the most emotionally mature responses that we can have. Curiosity asks questions before reaching those conclusions. Curiosity is willing to ask and help understand the situation. Curiosity is willing to be wrong. Certainty, on the other hand, often closes the door before the conversation has even started. Looking back, I don't think the hardest part was somebody believing the rumor about me in the first place. It's realizing how quickly those assumptions replaced questions. In this entire experience, I learned something that we can all take from this experience. Someday it might not be my story. Someday it may be yours, or your spouse's, or your child's, your closest friend. When that day comes, I hope that we're the kind of people who pause long enough to ask one more question before deciding that we've already found the answer. Psychology tells us something interesting about public conflict. When disagreements move from private conversations into public spaces, they often stop being about understanding and start becoming about social positioning. Once there's an audience, people naturally become more concerned with protecting their image and defending the version of events that they've already shared than discovering what actually happened. That's because humans are deeply motivated by reputation. Our brains evolved to protect our standing within that group because historically, that exclusion from the group threatened our survival. In other words, the larger the audience becomes, the harder honest conversation follows. People are no longer just protecting the truth, they're protecting the story that they've created. They're protecting their image. That's why I keep coming back to this one thought. Drama needs an audience, resolution does not. Drama needs a campaign and the attention that comes with it in order to prove what's not true. I don't know what anyone else's intentions were during my whole experience, and I don't want to pretend that I do. I know how the experience felt from my perspective. When conflict becomes public before it ever becomes personal, it often becomes much harder to resolve. Maybe that's the whole thing, though. Maybe it was never meant to be resolved in the first place. That's one of the reasons I believe direct communication is so critical in situations like this. When I reached out privately, genuinely trying to understand what was happening, I wasn't met with curiosity. I wasn't met with questions. I wasn't even met with a conversation. I was met with a very vague response, silence, and even distance. This is why confirmation bias is so powerful. We are taught growing up that if we're honest, eventually everything works itself out. Unfortunately, life doesn't always work that way. Sometimes once people become emotionally invested in a particular version of events, changing their minds becomes incredibly difficult. Not necessarily because they're bad people, but because changing their minds also means admitting that they have been wrong. And that's uncomfortable. If the goal had truly been resolution in this situation, the very first conversation would have happened with me, the person involved. Remember when I said that drama needs an audience? Sometimes people seek validation because validation reduces that uncertainty. It gives reassurance that our version of events is correct. It also gives us a sense of certainty when we feel emotionally uncomfortable. Psychology reminds us that our brains naturally try to reduce that emotional discomfort as quickly as possible. Sometimes we do that in healthy ways, sometimes we don't. Projection is one example. Instead of sitting with our own fears, insecurities, and unresolved emotions, we unconsciously place those feelings onto someone else. Another example is externalization. Rather than facing our own emotional discomfort, we locate the problem somewhere outside of ourselves. Neither response necessarily comes from malice. Many times, people aren't intentionally trying to hurt someone. They're simply trying to regulate emotions they don't know how to process. That doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it can help us understand why it happens. Understanding behavior isn't the same thing as agreeing with it. That's an important distinction here. At the end of the day, character is not defined by the story someone tells about another person. Character is revealed by the choices that someone consistently makes. It's revealed about how they speak about people who are not in the room. It's revealed by how they handle conflict, whether they choose curiosity over certainty and conversation over assumption. Looking back, I also understand why I reacted with long text messages. I wondered if I was over explaining. I was trying to protect my identity. Psychologically, one of our deepest human needs is the need to feel accurately understood. When we believe someone has formed an inaccurate picture of who we are, our instinct is often to explain ourselves, not because we're trying to win an argument, but because we're trying to restore what feels true. When you realize that conversations have been happening about you without you, it's completely normal to want to defend yourself, voice your opinion, and be part of that conversation, providing context, answering questions, protecting your character. But eventually, I had to remind myself I don't have to prove myself to anyone. If you're listening today and you felt the same way, if you have replayed conversations in your head, over explained, questioned your own reality because of someone else's questioning your character, I hope that you remember this too. You don't have to prove your worth. You don't have to prove your truth. The people who genuinely want to know you will make room for your voice before they make up their minds. The right people will know. And if they don't know, they will take the time to understand. My personal experience that I have shared really has tested my trust, my confidence, and reminded me of that fact that I don't have to seek approval or acceptance from people whose values don't align with mine. I also don't think that the lesson is people cannot be trusted. I think the lesson is that trust should be earned, not assumed. Not everyone is going to have pure intentions. Not everyone is going to handle conflict with emotional maturity. That's okay because that's on them. One of the healthiest things that we can learn as an adult is that not every relationship deserves access to us. Not every relationship deserves unlimited access to us. Learning to recognize emotional safety in others is part of becoming healthier within ourselves. Emotional safety is not about finding people who always agree with us. It's about finding people who are willing to be curious before they become certain. People who ask questions before making accusations. People who protect your reputation when you're not in the room as much as they protect it when you are there. One of the hardest parts about being falsely accused is that the conversation does not always end when everyone else stops talking about it. Our brains attempt to solve problems that have no clear solution. Psychologists refer to this as our mind's drive for cognitive closure. When something feels unresolved, our brains keep returning to it, almost like an unfinished puzzle. We replay conversations, facial expressions, replay text messages. We pretty much replay every detail, wondering if we somehow missed something that could help us make sense of all of this. It's completely natural. Our minds are trying to restore a sense of certainty. The difficult part is that sometimes there isn't another piece of the puzzle to find. Sometimes the answer is simply that person's story wasn't accurate. I think one of the biggest problems here is that we've confused agreement with understanding. Agreeing with someone over a rumor is often easier. You don't have to know the truth. You don't have to know the person. You don't have to tolerate that uncertainty. You simply agree. Whereas understanding is much harder. It requires patience, curiosity, humility. It requires listening to someone's story without immediately filtering it through your own assumptions. One of the biggest pieces of psychology I want to leave you with is that we're taught emotionally healthy or emotionally healed people don't experience emotions like insecurity, jealousy, rejection, or disappointment. However, that's simply not true. The difference is not whether they experience the emotion. They absolutely do. The difference is what they do with it. Psychologists often talk about something called emotional regulation. If you've heard my podcast before, you've heard me talk about emotional regulation. But if you haven't, emotional regulation is our ability to experience difficult emotions without allowing those emotions to dictate our behavior. That is a skill, not a personality trait. When someone has strong emotional regulation, they can feel hurt without trying to hurt someone else. They can feel insecure without needing to diminish another person. They can feel left out without creating exclusion for someone else. They can feel misunderstood without creating misunderstandings about someone else. They can tolerate discomfort without immediately trying to make someone else carry it for them. That's being emotionally mature. On the other hand, when someone has not developed healthy skills or ways to regulate difficult emotions, those emotions can come out sideways as gossip, defensiveness, controlling the narrative, blame, avoidance, projection, sometimes even attempts to recruit other people into the conflict. More often than not, these are attempts to reduce emotional discomfort. Psychology refers to many of these responses as maladaptive coping strategies. These strategies are attempts to feel better in the short term that ultimately create more pain in the long term for ourselves and everyone around us. Another concept I think about is that psychological projection that we talked about earlier. I think it's worth slowing down here because it's something that all of us do at different times. Projection happens when we unconsciously assign our own fears, insecurities, and unresolved internal conflicts onto someone else. For example, someone who feels deeply insecure about trust may become suspicious of people who've never actually given them a reason to be suspicious. A person that fears rejection may begin rejecting others first. Someone who is experiencing shame may become hyper aware of flaws in everyone else around them because focusing on someone else's flaws temporarily distracts them from sitting with their own. Our brains are constantly trying to protect us, but protection is not always the same thing as truth. Sometimes our mind creates stories that feel emotionally safer than that uncertainty. That doesn't make these stories accurate. That's why self-awareness matters so much. Having healthy coping skills like patience, curiosity, being willing to ask ourselves, is this actually happening, or is this my nervous system trying to protect me from something? Research in interpersonal psychology consistently shows that healthy relationships are built on a few simple behaviors: curiosity, direct communication, repair after conflict, accountability, trust that is earned over time. Now, notice what's missing from this list: rumors, gossip, recruiting an audience, assumptions, public humiliation. None of these build healthy relationships. They build distance, fear, misunderstanding. Healthy relationships don't grow through certainty, they grow through curiosity. Before we move on, I want to leave you with a few questions, not because I expect you to have the answers today, but because I think the healthiest people are the ones who are willing to ask themselves difficult questions. As you've been listening to this episode, maybe something immediately came to mind. Maybe it's a person, maybe it's an experience. Maybe you thought about a person who hurt you, the person who misunderstood you, or the person who questioned your character. But I'd also encourage you to ask yourself something a little more uncomfortable. Have I ever believed a story about someone without taking the time to get to know them myself? Have I ever allowed someone else's opinion to become my own? Have I ever mistaken familiarity for truth? Have I ever repeated something because I assumed it was accurate instead of knowing that it was? Have I chosen agreement because it was easier than curiosity? I'm not asking these questions to create guilt. I ask them because every single one of us has a brain that's wired the same way. Every single one of us is capable of making assumptions. Every single one of us has experienced confirmation bias, and we've probably misunderstood someone at some point in our lives. The goal is not to pretend that we are above these patterns. The goal is to become aware of them, because awareness gives us a choice. The next time someone tells you a story about another person, pause before deciding what you believe. The next time you feel yourself filling in the blanks, ask yourself whether you're working with facts or assumptions. The next time you are tempted to join a conversation about someone who is not in the room, ask yourself whether those words are building understanding or simply building another version of the story. This is where emotional maturity begins. Not when we stop making mistakes, but when we're willing to examine our own minds just as carefully as we examine everyone else's. The truth is, we are all capable of becoming the misunderstood person, and we are all capable of becoming the person who misunderstands someone else. The real question with all of this is, what are we going to do with that awareness? Let's look at a couple of examples. Imagine that you start a new job. During your first week, a coworker leans over and says, "Be careful around Sarah. She's rude, she's hard to work with, and nobody really likes her." Without even realizing it, you've started looking at Sarah through that lens. The first time she walks by without saying hello, your brain says, "See, they were right." But what if Sarah wasn't rude at all? What if she had just lost a parent? What if she was going through a divorce? What if she is painfully shy? The thing is that she did not change. The story that you were given changed the way that you interpreted her. Imagine you're standing at your child's sporting event. Another parent tells you that one of the moms had already been talking about everybody else behind their backs. You don't know whether it's true, but now every interaction with that mom feels different. Every conversation seems suspicious. Every question she asks seems nosy. Every glance feels intentional. Nothing about her behavior changed. The only thing that changed was the story that your brain was carrying. Now ask yourself, how many people have I really never gotten to know because I accepted someone else's version of reality with that person? How many opportunities for friendship have I missed because I believed a story instead of creating my own experience? How many times have I been more quiet around someone because of something I heard rather than something I witnessed? If someone was telling a story about me, would I want people to make up their minds before hearing my side? These assumptions don't build relationships, they erode them. I think that's one of the biggest lessons that we can learn. We cannot control someone else's level of emotional maturity. We cannot control whether someone chooses curiosity or certainty, like or dislike. We cannot control whether someone protects our reputation when we're not in the room. We can control the kind of person that we become because of what happened to us. It's too easy to cling on to rumors instead of facts, but we can choose the kind of nervous system that we continue to build with, one that values peace over performance, truth over attention, character over reputation, direct conversations over indirect ones, understanding over assumptions. We can choose to become the kind of people who protect someone else's dignity instead of recruiting others against them. Healing is refusing to become the kind of person who repeats the very thing that wounded us. Mean girl behavior does not disappear with age. It evolves. The face changes, the roles change, the environments change. The patterns often remain the same. Sometimes it's not whispered conversation in the middle school hallway. Sometimes it's exclusion without explanation at a job or in a group setting. Assumptions over questions, silence over honesty. A smile in someone's presence while quietly dismantling their reputation after they leave the room. Behavior becomes more subtle, more socially acceptable, more difficult to recognize. The emotional impact can be just as profound. We are all modeling what healthy relationships look like for people watching us: our children, our spouses, our families, our friends, our coworkers, our communities. Every conversation teaches us something and teaches someone about what conflict is supposed to look like. Every disagreement teaches someone whether relationships are built through curiosity or certainty. We repeat what we don't repair, whether we protect someone's dignity or participate in tearing it down. It's so easy to become the very thing that hurt you. It's easy to become bitter, angry, defensive. It's easy to convince ourselves that hurting someone back is how you make the hurt disappear, but it doesn't. I have felt that temptation myself, especially after everything I have shared with you today. I have immediately wanted to defend myself in certain situations. I've sent text messages that, looking back, were not my finest moments. I can admit that, but I also understand now what was happening inside of me. I was not trying to destroy someone else's character. I was desperately trying to protect my own. And that's the difference between me and a mean girl. Knowing that my name hadn't been publicly protected in rooms that I was not in brought out emotions that I didn't know I was still carrying. I'm working on that. I'm still growing. I'm still learning. I'm still becoming more emotionally mature myself. I don't think that the goal is perfection because we can never be perfect, but the goal for me is awareness. I think that's the goal for a lot of people, even if we don't realize that. Growth, humility, choosing over and over again not to become the very thing that hurt us. One of the biggest things that this experience specifically has taught me is that certainty can sometimes be far more dangerous than curiosity. I want you to think about that for a second. The moment that we become absolutely convinced that we already know someone's intentions, their motives, or their character, we stop asking questions. We stop listening. If we just cared about protecting someone else's reputation as much as we care about protecting our own, things would look a lot different. Before I move into what I want to say directly to a mean girl, I think there's one more lesson that this experience taught me, and I think it's valuable to share it with you. Healing does not always look like the way that we expect it to. I used to think healing meant eventually you stop thinking about what happened, that one day memories no longer bother you. You never replay the conversations, question yourself, or wonder why you could have done something differently. But I don't think that's what healing is. I think that healing is about remembering what happened without allowing it to decide who you become. Choosing to not let someone else's behavior rewrite your values. Refusing to allow bitterness to become your personality. Deciding that the pain stops with you. One of the questions I've had to ask myself over and over again is, who do I want to become because of this? Do I want to become more suspicious of everyone? Do I want to become someone who assumes the worst in people? Do I want to tear others down because I know what it's like to feel torn down myself? Or do I want this experience to make me wiser without making me colder, more discerning without becoming cynical, more protected without becoming closed off? I don't think that healing asks us to pretend people did not hurt us. I think that healing asks us to become more intentional about what we carry forward and what we choose to leave behind. Every painful experience gives us a choice. We can pass on our pain, or we can transform it into wisdom. I don't know about you, but I want my pain to produce wisdom, not more wounded people. I want this experience to make me someone who listens more carefully, who asks more questions, who protects people's names when they are not in the room, someone who chooses courage over comfort when difficult conversations need to happen. At the end of the day, that's the kind of person that I hope I'm becoming. And with that, that's what leads me into the last part of our episode. I want people to know that if they leave a conversation with me, their name is just as protected after they leave the room as it was when they were standing in it. To me, that's what integrity looks like. If you've ever been the victim of a mean girl, I want you to remember someone else's behavior is never a measurement of your own worth. It's a reflection of where they are emotionally, not who you are. Emotionally healthy people don't feel the need to diminish someone else to feel secure within themselves. They don't need that audience to validate their perspective. They don't need to recruit people to stand beside them before they've ever spoken to the person standing in front of them. If someone is truly your friend, they'll make room for a conversation before they make up their mind. The best thing we can do when we're met with hostility is not to become more hostile. It's to refuse to let someone else's behavior determine our own. Now, that doesn't mean that you allow people to mistreat you. It doesn't mean that you abandon healthy boundaries. It does not mean pretending something didn't hurt you. It simply means refusing to become the very thing that hurt you. Don't forget that rumors move quickly, while character moves quietly. Given enough time, character almost always outlives the rumor. Before I leave today's episode, I want you to leave with one final thought in mind. Everything that we've talked about today has focused on one person misunderstanding another person. But what happens when that story grows? What happens when it stops belonging to one individual and starts belonging to an entire group? What happens when a rumor becomes part of a group's identity? What happens when questioning the story suddenly feels like questioning the group itself? That's where we begin talking about scapegoating, triangulation, group polarization, social exclusion, the bystander effect. Why perfectly good people sometimes stay silent even when something doesn't feel right. In part 2, we're going to discuss something much deeper. We're going to talk about why groups sometimes need a villain, why defending yourself can actually strengthen the accusation, why silence spreads like wildfire, why one person's assumption can slowly become another person's reputation. Once that private misunderstanding becomes a public narrative, the psychology changes, and so does the damage. Until then, I'm going to leave you with this. Not every opinion deserves your attention. Not every rumor deserves your defense. And not every story told about you deserves your participation. Dear Mean Girl, I don't hate you. I don't wish you harm. In fact, I have empathy for you. I hope that you find peace. I hope that you find enough peace within yourself that you no longer feel the need to find it by talking about someone else. I hope that you experience friendships where honesty feels safer than gossip. Difficult conversations happen face to face instead of behind closed doors. And when I say that, I'm not talking about spreading rumors with someone else. I'm talking about having a conversation with the person that you're accusing, where trust is built through truth instead of assumptions. You taught me lessons that I never would have chosen to learn. The truth is, I've learned more about mean girl behavior in my 30s than I ever did in middle school or high school. You taught me that not every invitation deserves my RSVP. If I'm not respected in that room, I don't need a seat at the table, because belonging is not worth sacrificing my peace. It's not worth sacrificing my character just to be accepted. You also reminded me of something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I cannot control the stories people choose to tell about me. I can control the story I continue to live. I will choose integrity over image, grace over resentment, boundaries over approval. You reminded me that I never want another woman to leave a conversation with me questioning her worth, questioning whether she can trust me, questioning whether she was safe with me. If people leave my presence, I want them to know that their name is just as protected. That's character. And unlike rumors, character does not have to be announced. Eventually, it will speak for itself. We have a choice. Every single day, we have a choice. We can become another voice that spreads a story, or we can become a person who pauses long enough to ask a question. We can build walls through assumptions, or we can build trust through curiosity. We can protect our own reputation while destroying someone else's. Or we can become the kind of person who protects people's names when they're not at the table. At the end of our lives, people probably won't remember every rumor they've heard, every disagreement that they've witnessed, or every accusation that was made. But they will remember how you made them feel. They'll remember whether they felt safe with you. They'll remember whether you chose integrity when it was not convenient, kindness when it was not deserved, and truth when it would have been easier to believe the story everyone else was telling. And to me, that's the kind of legacy worth leaving. Tune in next week for part 2. We have a lot more to discuss. I hope you guys have a great week, and I will see you next time.